What if a comic book tied to one of the greatest science fiction franchises ever created is still sitting in the shadows of the collectible market? While investors chase first appearances of superheroes or chase modern speculation spikes, a quieter question has started to appear among collectors. Could Dune #1 become a sleeper investment as the franchise continues expanding in the 2020s? With new films, television projects, and renewed interest in the universe created by Frank Herbert, collectors are starting to revisit older Dune collectibles. But the real question is simple. Is Dune #1 actually a good investment in 2026? Or is it simply a niche collectible riding temporary hype? Dune #1 refers to the Marvel comic adaptation connected to the 1984 film, produced by Marvel, with writing by Ralph Macchio and artwork by Bill Sienkiewicz, as part of the official comic adaptation of the story. This series appeared in the mid-1980s and represents one of the earliest comic interpretations of the Dune universe in mainstream comics publishing. To determine whether Dune #1 is a good investment in 2026, we need to examine the bigger forces that drive collectible value. Price alone rarely tells the full story. Instead, collectors typically evaluate franchise strength, scarcity dynamics, cultural momentum, and long-term narrative relevance. When those factors align, even relatively affordable comics can become strong performers over time. The first major factor to consider is franchise strength and cultural momentum. Dune is widely regarded as one of the most influential science fiction stories ever written. The franchise has expanded through novels, films, television development, comics, and games, maintaining relevance for decades. Every time a new film adaptation or spin-off project arrives, it introduces the universe to a new generation of fans. That continuous renewal matters for collectibles because demand tends to follow cultural exposure. When audiences rediscover a story through modern media, collectors often seek earlier artifacts connected to the franchise's history. In the early 2020s, the new cinematic adaptations brought the Dune universe back into global conversation. Film releases dramatically expanded the audience beyond traditional science fiction readers. This phenomenon has appeared repeatedly in collectible markets. When a franchise re-enters mainstream culture, the earliest books tied to that universe often gain attention. Even when prices do not spike immediately, increased visibility can create a stronger foundation for long-term demand. Another key element of franchise strength is narrative depth. Unlike some properties built around a single character, Dune contains an entire political, ecological, and philosophical universe. That complexity makes the franchise adaptable across multiple formats, from films to streaming series to graphic novels. The broader and deeper a fictional universe becomes, the more collectible material it can support. The second factor influencing the investment potential of Dune #1 is supply and scarcity. Scarcity is one of the most powerful drivers of value in collectible markets. However, scarcity does not simply mean a low print run. It often refers to the availability of copies in collectible condition. Many comics from the 1980s were printed in relatively large numbers compared with earlier eras. That means raw copies of Dune #1 still appear on the market fairly regularly. Price guides suggest that typical copies in mid-grade condition can sell for relatively modest amounts, sometimes under $30, while near-mint copies may approach $50 depending on condition. This price structure reveals an interesting dynamic. The book itself is not extremely rare, but pristine copies may be significantly harder to find. Over time, collectors increasingly focus on high-grade preservation. That means the most desirable copies are those that survive decades without major wear. When a collectible has a wide price gap between average copies and elite condition copies, it often signals that condition scarcity is becoming an important factor. The third factor to examine is historical significance within the comic medium itself. Dune #1 is not simply another licensed comic. It represents one of the earliest comic adaptations of the Dune universe produced by a major publisher. The artwork by Bill Sienkiewicz also gives the book a distinctive visual identity that appeals to comic art collectors. Licensed adaptations sometimes receive less attention than original superhero stories, but that perception can change when the source material becomes culturally dominant. The comic adaptation captures a moment in science fiction history when publishers believed the Dune film might become the next Star Wars level phenomenon. Even though the 1984 film received mixed reception at the time, the franchise eventually returned stronger through later adaptations. The fourth factor involves market psychology and collector behavior. One of the most interesting patterns in comic collecting is the rediscovery cycle. A book may remain relatively overlooked for decades before a new generation of collectors revisits it. This often happens when cultural interest shifts back toward the original material behind a popular franchise. When collectors begin rediscovering a book, the market tends to move in stages. First comes curiosity. Collectors notice the book's connection to a major franchise. Next comes research, where people examine print runs, grading populations, and historical context. If interest continues growing, demand gradually increases. However, it is important to recognize that market psychology can also introduce risk. When speculation becomes too aggressive, prices can spike quickly and then cool just as fast. In the case of Dune No. 1, the relatively modest price level may actually work in its favor. Lower entry prices allow collectors to buy without extreme financial risk, which can create a broader base of ownership. The fifth factor is long-term narrative relevance. Many collectibles rise and fall depending on whether their associated characters or stories remain culturally visible. Some franchises fade from public consciousness, reducing demand for related memorabilia. Others continue evolving through new media, keeping the original works relevant. Dune appears to belong to the second category. The story's themes, ecology, political power, religion, and human evolution, remain remarkably relevant decades after the novel's original publication. This thematic depth allows new adaptations to reinterpret the story for different generations. As long as filmmakers and writers continue exploring the Dune universe, early collectibles tied to the franchise may benefit from renewed attention. Each adaptation effectively acts as a marketing campaign for the original story and its historical artifacts. Of course, no collectible investment is guaranteed. Several risks still exist. The first risk is oversupply of mid-grade copies. If collectors flood the market with raw issues, prices for average copies may remain relatively stable rather than rising dramatically. The second risk involves adaptation cycles. Interest in the franchise may fluctuate depending on the success of future films or television projects. Another risk is competition from other collectibles tied to the same franchise. For example, first edition novels, rare posters, or modern graphic novels could draw collector attention away from older comic adaptations. Collectible markets often distribute demand across multiple categories within the same franchise. Despite these risks, the relatively low entry cost of Dune No. 1 may make it attractive for collectors who believe in the long-term expansion of the franchise. Unlike high-value superhero keys that require thousands of dollars to acquire, Dune No. 1 remains accessible. Accessibility can sometimes support gradual price growth because more collectors can participate in the market. Ultimately, determining whether Dune No. 1 is a good investment in 2026 depends on expectations. It is unlikely to behave like a rare Golden Age comic with extreme scarcity. However, it may function as a sleeper collectible, connected to one of the most influential science fiction universes ever created. When evaluating collectibles, the most important question is often not how quickly the price might rise, but how durable the cultural foundation behind the item truly is. In the case of Dune, that foundation appears strong. The franchise has already survived multiple decades, multiple adaptations, and multiple generations of readers. That longevity gives the comic a narrative advantage. Even if prices remain modest in the short term, the continued growth of the Dune universe could gradually strengthen collector interest. Over time, the combination of franchise expansion, condition scarcity, and cross-media relevance may give Dune #1 a stronger position within the science fiction collectible market. In the end, the smartest collectible strategies often combine patience with curiosity. Instead of chasing only the most famous keys, many collectors look for books that connect to powerful stories before the wider market fully recognizes them. Dune #1 may fall into that category. A book tied to a legendary universe, still accessible, and quietly waiting to see how the next chapters of the franchise unfold. If you enjoy exploring the intersection of science fiction storytelling and collectible investing, consider subscribing and joining the discussion. Let me know in the comments whether you believe Dune #1 has long-term potential, or if you think other sci-fi comics offer stronger opportunities in the coming years. The most interesting discoveries in collecting often happen long before the spotlight arrives.